Okay, we can go ahead and get started. I know we're a couple minutes after 2. Thank you for all those that have joined on the call. My name is Kevin Pappas. I'm the training manager here at 10C, and we're really excited to have you guys joining us today. We have Payal Avellan from the Wooden Floor joining us, who's the Director of Marketing and Communications, and she's going to be presenting on crisis communications and just providing us all with a helpful overview of how to navigate our communication strategy and communicating with key stakeholders during this time, how to get your message out effectively. But before we jump in, I just wanted to let you all know, I'm sure most of you have been on some of our other webinars, but we have a variety of other resources coming up this week. We actually have one every day So we have 15-minute consultations where you can sign up with one of our nonprofit professionals to get specific help on different organizational issues or challenges you might be facing. So whether that's corporate volunteer engagement, your organizational strategy, more of your back office needs like your finance and HR, 10C has those 15-minute sessions that you can jump on with one of our specialists. So I just want to direct you over to that resource page to sign up for that as well. But yeah, if you have any questions about upcoming webinars, trainings, or anything that 10C is doing, feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat box. In just a second, I'm going to pass it off to Payal, but I want to let you know we will have a time of Q&A at the end of this meeting. So as we're going through the presentation, if Payal brings up any points that you need greater clarity on or have more questions, feel free to put those in the chat box, and we'll have a time of Q&A at the end. But without any other announcements, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Payal, to jump on in.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for joining me. I had mentioned to Kevin earlier that I am not a crisis communication specialist. I am I'm more generalized. So this is just real top level best practices, and it's not completely, it touches on some of the things that we've addressed during COVID-19, but it's general crises overall that it'll touch on the best practices of that. So I'll just get started with an introduction. So I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the Wooden Floor, as Kevin mentioned. I've been there for 12 years. Prior to the Wooden Floor, I actually had a career in broadcasting. I was with NPR, National Public Radio, before joining the Wooden Floor. And before that, I was at KJazz, which is a jazz radio station in Los Angeles. And when I was at NPR, as much as I love NPR, I love listening to it, it was not as fun to make. I think that you have to be a very special person, almost like maybe a social worker or a therapist, where you can really compartmentalize, because it's a lot of death and destruction all day. And so at that point, I kind of reassessed and said, you know, I really like the communications and I really like the arts, and put that out there, and really wanted a career that married the two. And so I landed at the Wooden Floor from NPR, and it's been wonderful. Obviously, I've been there 12 years, so it's lasted quite a long time. And what the Wooden Floor does is we break the cycle of poverty in kids from low-income backgrounds through access to the arts, through a long-term immersion in dance. So we have 3 main components to our programs. Dance is the center of student transformation. So that's where you're learning to formulate your ideas. So our students actually present their own ideas in their dances. You also formulate your ability to work in a team, because a dance is a group effort. You learn, you know, to be really disciplined, and you can see that discipline pay off in your own body. So something your body couldn't do a week ago, you can do now. And that sort of helps reinforce that if I keep going, I'll get better. So that's the dance component. And then we have a family services component, and that's basically, you know, sort of social services. So we have free counseling and crisis intervention for any family that needs it. We serve 500 students almost and their families. So we help them with that. And then we also have wellness workshops. So we have targeted workshops that focus on the different developmental ages and helps them make the transition to the next developmental age. For example, in middle school, we're going over, the things that become central to your life in high school. We talk about self-esteem and communication with your parents, social media. And then the other aspect of our mission is we do access to higher education. So that starts with just our students. It's a 10-year journey. They start in 3rd grade and they end in when they graduate high school. And so when they start with us, we just have to make sure they're up at grade level. And then from there, we start college and career readiness as early as 6th grade. And so that's sort of exploring what they're good at, what they're interested in, what kind of careers would be a good fit for them. And also getting them free tutoring. We have the tutoring center. They can either walk in, or if their GPA is below a certain GPA, they are mandated to be in that tutoring. And then college and career readiness. So we go over things like, we take them on college tours. We provide free Kaplan SAT. That's a huge barrier for someone who can't afford it to just sort of be on par with everyone else taking the SAT. And Kaplan actually comes to our site, so there's no transportation barrier. So that's just some of what we do at the Wooden Floor. Our big claim to fame is that 100% of our students that graduate from the Wooden Floor immediately enroll in higher education. And their socioeconomic bracket, it's about 45%. So that's more than double. So we know it works. We're a 37-year-old organization. And I have been in APR since 2016. And an APR is someone who's accredited in public relations. And what I did that for was that in 2016, the Wooden Floor was getting ready to launch a $27 million campaign, a four-year $27 million campaign. We just ended that this year. Didn't quite get to end it. We just sort of stopped talking about it. But I wanted to ensure that my skill levels were ready for that big, giant endeavor of raising $27 million. So I will move on from that and just jump into the crisis portion of things. So what constitutes a crisis? So that's a situation that's reached a phase where intervention is necessary to avoid or repair damage to the organization. And it's also anything like a situation that we're in now with COVID-19 that would cause an unusual increase in interest or activity from the news media, social media, or the public in general. So, here are some basic tips, and we'll go into each one of these as we go down. And we'll create and follow a notification protocol. We identify and prioritize our audiences. We manage the message and the media. We communicate early and often. We do not lie. We do not ignore the situation. So those last three, communicate early and often, do not lie, and do not ignore, those will constitute the 3 T's, which we'll get into a little bit later on. So examples from the Wooden Floor: identify the crisis and get all the facts available when the crisis is uncovered. So for us, we phone tree all department heads, and then executive leadership identifies a crisis team and then convenes a meeting or a conference call with that crisis team. And then executive leadership identifies a spokesperson based on the situation. So sometimes that could be your CEO, sometimes it's your board chair, sometimes it's your director of communications. But it's really important to have that single person kind of be the voice of the situation in the organization. So identify and prioritize your audiences. So for us, that means that the marketing department identifies the relevant audiences. Parents, press, staff, board, donors, faculty, those are examples from the Wooden Floor. Executive leadership then prioritizes which audiences are the most important. And then, so that means like, who are we going to communicate to first? And then we craft communications tailored to that audience. So what I'm going to say to the students of the Wooden Floor and their parents is going to be worded differently than how I would say it to the press or how I would say it to the board of directors. So we put everything in order, who needs to get this message first, and then we make key messages and then tailor those key messages to each audience. So you're sort of speaking the language of the audience you're talking to at that particular point. So here's a question. I think the way it's structured today, you can just kind of answer in your mind. Who is always your number one audience? It's actually your internal audiences. Some people think it might be the press or your donors, but it's actually your staff. For us, our students, our internal audiences at the Wooden Floor, we've identified several of them. So our board of directors, our year-round staff, we also have part-time seasonal staff that get different messaging because there's different relevancies. So I think some organizations are better at this than other organizations, but if your internal team doesn't know the key messages of a situation, when your constituents then come and ask those questions, your team is going to be flat-footed if they're not fully prepared for the communications that's going out more widely. So usually here I stop for thoughts or questions. Kevin, do you want me to keep going, or do we have any questions so far?
I haven't seen any questions come through. Anyone, if you have any thoughts or questions up to this point, feel free to shoot those in the chat box. Otherwise, I think we're probably good just to keep going, Payal.
Let's do it. So managing the message in the media. So these again are examples from the Wooden Floor. So the marketing department identifies the communications outlets, and these can be forced and voluntary. And forced basically means these folks are coming to you. So the newspaper calls up and says, I need you to tell me about this. Or, you know, if the families you serve says, we want to know more about this situation. And then voluntary for us was more along the lines of what happened with COVID, where we were going out with the message ourselves, and we did it at the timing that was right for us. In a way, you know, we knew we had to act, we had to close our building, et cetera, but we could sort of manage the timing of when everything got released basically as fast as we could work. So different outlets include traditional press, online press, web outlets, email blasts, mailed letters, text blasts. Texting is huge for us at the Wooden Floor. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. So those are just examples of outlets. So again, our example of our crisis communication structure is a written press statement developed by the marketing department, and sometimes with joint legal counsel, so PR and legal counsel if necessary. A response should be available to the public within 1 to 2 hours after a crisis. And, you know, I put in there legal counsel because sometimes there are legal issues. Sometimes if it's an HR issue that's become public, or other sorts of things, you might want to have that legal counsel. But I'm a really firm believer that you need both counsels. So there's winning in court, and then there's winning in the court of public opinion. And there are examples where someone has won their lawsuit, but lost the confidence of people. And so they've therefore lost their brand. So I'm a very strong proponent that you need both. You need to listen to both sides and try to find some middle ground. So aim to be transparent. So for us, the marketing department will develop key messages and frequently ask questions for everyone in-house. Again, that number one audience is your in-house audience. And for every advocate. So they're armed to respond when discussing the matter with the media, parents, donors, other stakeholders. And this is something that I'm really adamant about as well. Staff should only speak to constituents inside their normal realm. So I'm marketing and communications. I'm not going to go out and start talking to children. Children are not my area of expertise. I didn't study that. Yes, I work with children and it's amazing. I love it, but I'm not necessarily educated specifically in child development or speaking to children. So I'm not going to go out to them. The folks that normally speak to them are the folks that are normally going to be addressing this with them. Likewise, the folks that deal with the children are not going to be talking to the press because that's my forte and what I've studied and learned about. So we're really careful that we speak to the constituents inside our normal areas. So that's another big one for me. So the 3 T's I had mentioned earlier. So these rules apply most of the time, but each crisis is individual, and so rules can be slightly amended as needed. Again, I was mentioning, you know, sometimes there's things you can't discuss legally, and so in those cases, you want to say what you can. So tell it fast or first. So if you can get ahead of the story and break the news yourself, it's really advisable. It allows initial public knowledge to be released on your terms. So someone else isn't telling your story for you. You're sort of getting out ahead of it and telling it in the way that you feel is appropriate, rather than in a more defensive way, I guess. And so if the story breaks on its own, you need to respond fast as you possibly can. 1 to 2 hours is tops. So then we move on to tell the truth. So communicate the facts, provide the media or any of your publics with a statement and a spokesperson available for comment. Stick to the facts, stay empathetic without initially assigning blame or assigning fault. If it's later determined the organization's at fault, that definitely needs to be acknowledged and an apology should be issued upon consultation with a lawyer. You want to word those things carefully, but if there is a fault involved for your organization, it's much better to be open about that, because the truth tends to come out. And again, if it's not coming out on your terms, now you're in the defensive slot. And then tell it all. Again, there are things that we're not allowed to discuss legally, but don't try to hide any bad news, because negative media coverage is likely to be the result of that. And it can make your crisis continue beyond the initial crisis. So if bad news is imminent, it's best to tell the public yourself and not have it exposed for you. So we all come from a variety of different organizations. Not everyone has a marketing department. I myself, when I started at the Wooden Floor, it was just me. I was the marketing department, but now I'm lucky enough to have 2 more people that work with me in marketing. But if you don't have, I mean, some organizations have just a part-time person or it's just the founder. So figure out how to leverage external supports. You can leverage your board, you can create a volunteer group. I know 1OC has volunteer groups available to help organizations that need specific services. So those are just a few of the ideas. And then we'll sort of talk a little bit about after the initial storm. So after any sort of crisis, it's always good to look for opportunities to share good news. Good news helps clean up a crisis. So basically what that means is if you Google search, hopefully the new information and the good information is going to float to the top, and they're going to be more trafficked than the bad news situations. So hopefully that'll go up in the algorithm to pop up first when people Google your organization. Another thing that I'm really adamant about is don't be afraid to repeat your messaging. I think that, you know, when we're writing an email or whatever communication we're doing, we're spending a lot of time with that. And so we fully understand it, but most people don't absorb a message on the first round. In development, I think they say it takes 7 touches for someone to make their first gift. That's generally speaking, and in communications too, it takes quite a few reaches out to get the message to resonate. So repeat your message, be consistent with your messaging. Sometimes what you leave out speaks louder than what you put in. So I was mentioning a little bit earlier, sometimes we can't say everything, but you need to acknowledge that. So you need to say there's, you know, HR issues and we can't really get into those. So that's why we're not saying much, or, you know, sort of explain why you're not saying much. because people will make assumptions in an information vacuum. So, you know, we had an example, you know, at the wooden floor recently where someone, you know, as we shifted to virtual, someone wasn't on the calls anymore, and I started hearing from people that, you know, was that person terminated? Do they have COVID? And it was none of those things, you know. And so I just reached out and I said, hey, you guys need to explain this person's absence the best you can while remaining legal, you know, because people are making stuff up. Like they're turning on their own imagination and sort of answering the question for you. So so luckily, you know, they did address that. And I think there are ways to address things, even if you can't speak about them legally. So our CEO likes to end messages in a positive, hopeful, proactive note that doesn't leave people wondering either. So sort of, you know, underscore that confidence in the organization and its leadership. And then it's always really important to evaluate. So document responses you're getting in a crisis. I created a little worksheet that we use at the wooden floor, and it just sort of helps us track those responses so you can see, was it mostly negative? Was it neutral? Was it mostly positive? It helps you not only assess the situation, but assess your communications and how they were received so you can do your work better in the future. And then we always try to respond to comments on social media as soon as possible. Even we get phone calls, letters. We just try to make sure people feel heard, especially in a crisis, so that they can maintain confidence in your organization. So I'll go into social media in particular in a crisis. A lot of news stories break on social media before they break in traditional press. So make sure, we like to have at least 2 individuals in the organization that are receiving live updates on our social media. So if my Twitter's like going off, I will immediately check and see what that's all about and make sure it's a good thing. And mostly it is. It'll be like a news story or something like that. But it's always good, you know, and I have family overseas, and so when we're over there, I have to make sure someone locally is responding, because the time difference, it'll be, you know, opposite of here. So it's good to have more than one person tied into that in case something does occur. And then devise a smart response plan that's honest, transparent, and in keeping with the nature of digital communications, which is to be flexible. Social media is all about interaction. So if you don't respond in a quick, timely manner, it can be perceived as, you know, being like ignoring the situation or hiding something. Again, people make up their own ideas when there's a vacuum. So we try to be on it. All the social media is on my personal phone and my work phone, so that I can respond as soon as I am able to. And then if you're new to social media, I think there can be an inclination to want to delete negative posts, but that's only going to cause more backlash if posts from the public are deleted. Social media is about interaction. It's much better to address the cause of concern than try to hide it. So you'll notice a theme here in my presentation. Is just be straightforward, and you know, people are understanding, and they want to forgive and like and they are on your team, you know, if you're following social media. So truthfulness is the way to go. We created a social media governance policy. So that sort of helps us. It's sort of our North Star when we are in a sticky situation on social media. So when am I going to stop comments? When am I going to delete comments? And all of that is really carefully laid out in this governance policy. So before I take any action on someone, I'm following the guidebook that's been written on it before we were ever in whatever situation is causing me to have that concern. And then we also have a social media voice policy, and this would probably be more for you know, organizations that have more than one person managing their social media, and that helps us stay in a similar tone, me and the person that manages our social media, we're speaking the same way, the same language, and we also have different tones for different outlets. So the way we speak on LinkedIn is written out and delineated, and the way we speak on Instagram is written out, because those are two very different platforms with different audiences and different topics. So you know, Instagram is much more about emojis, and you probably wouldn't want to go heavy on the emojis on LinkedIn, for example. So in a crisis, your advocates will defend you. So it's really important to have those key messages for your internal stakeholders, and frequently asked questions are a great thing to share with everyone so that your advocates are armed to respond when discussing a matter on social media. So we're at the thoughts and questions part of things again. Anyone have anything to share?
I'd be curious if anyone has any thoughts or questions, feel free to type those in the chat box. But since we do have a little bit extra time on the call, if you have any best practices or approaches that your organization's taken, feel free to, there's not too many people on the call today, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and share. Otherwise, go ahead and type your questions in now. We'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that.
Yeah, even if you don't have any questions, just how that hit you, what you thought of it. I would love any sort of feedback that anyone has. Was it helpful?
Looks like we got a quieter group today. But it's no worries at all. Would it be okay, Payal, if I put your email or your contact information in here in case people have additional follow-up questions?
Absolutely, that's totally fine. And yeah, I completely understand. It's hard to, you know, if you're just absorbing something now, it can be hard to have questions. So I hope it was helpful. And this is something I shared with a nonprofit CEO group that was developed after the COVID crisis to kind of help each other through the crisis and to help us serve our constituents better. And so that from that, it was suggested that from 1OC that I presented again. So I hope it was helpful, and I hope everyone's doing okay, and your constituents are doing okay. It's an unprecedented time.
Certainly. Yeah, Payal, thank you so much, and thank you to the Wooden Floor, and thanks for taking the time to jump on this with us and share for our nonprofits. And I'll certainly be forwarding out your contact information if people have extra questions. But this was highly informative for me as well. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate your time and your interest too.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye-bye.